Imagine if I shared with you that one of the most terrifying figures in biblical accounts was actually counted among the Creator's most faithful celestial servants at one time. The name Azil sends shivers through the hearts of religious followers and academics in equal measure, yet this being wasn't always the chief architect of defiance and moral decay that we recognize in our current understanding. The reality is, his transformation from grace is so profoundly disturbing that complete volumes of holy writings were composed specifically to caution mankind about the danger he represents. Right now, we're about to explore the full, unvarnished account of Azil, moving from his beginnings among the elite ranks of paradise, all the way to his position as the mastermind behind humanity's initial widespread moral collapse. You're going to uncover hidden truths about this celestial being who fell from grace, things that the vast majority of people have simply never encountered, which include the prohibited wisdom he shared with human beings, and the reasons why the consequences he faced were different from any other punishment ever given. Now, before we really get started, I'd appreciate it if you'd take just a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, though I only want you to do this if you truly value the content I create here. I'm grateful you decided to join me for this discussion. Like I always do, I'm really curious to know what part of the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment letting us know your location and what the current time happens to be where you are. This genuinely helps us recognize what a worldwide community we've actually built together. So, shall we begin exploring today's narrative? The entity of the wasteland, deep within the ancient barren territories, in places where the blazing sun turns sand to fire and quietness becomes almost suffocating, a ceremonial practice exists that has left experts puzzled for literally thousands of years. Try to envision this scene. Standing there is the temple's high priest, positioned before a pair of goats, and both of these animals are completely flawless, without any kind of imperfection whatsoever. The first one will die upon the sacred altar, with its blood being presented as an offering to the divine presence. But the second animal, it's destined for something entirely different. The priest lays both of his hands directly on this second goat's head, and as he does this, he recites aloud the wrongdoings of all the people over the creature, moving every sin, every mistake, every dark intention onto this breathing animal. After this, the goat gets taken away, pushed out into the harsh wilderness where absolutely no one lives. The animal takes with it the burden of an entire nation's guilt into the vast emptiness that lies beyond where people dwell. Here's the detail that makes this ceremony genuinely disturbing, though. This goat doesn't just get let loose in the wild like you might think. If you look at what the text says in Leviticus chapter 16, it tells us the animal is sent for Azil, not toward Azil, not on account of Azil, but specifically for him. The Hebrew word used there points to a destination, suggesting someone or something waiting in those abandoned places. This whole ceremony takes place one time each year during the Day of Atonement, which happens to be the most sacred day in the entire ancient religious calendar. The high priest goes into the holiest space imaginable, the inner sanctuary where the divine presence actually dwells, and he carries out intricate rituals that involve incense, blood, and extremely careful attention to every single detail of the process. A single error could result in his death. You can almost feel the tension hanging in the air like thick smoke. But even with all this sacred activity happening, this particular ceremony involving the goat is unique. While the blood of one goat purifies the sanctuary itself, the other goat doesn't meet its end on consecrated ground. Instead, it disappears into the wilderness, and the scripture informs us that this wilderness has an owner. It belongs to Azil. Rabbis from ancient times argued extensively about what this name actually meant. Some took the position that it was simply describing the rocky, hazardous landscape where they sent the goat. Others maintained it pointed to something far more unsettling, a being who makes his home in those abandoned regions, some kind of force that exists beyond the limits of civilization and divine structure. The ritual itself shows us something deeply meaningful about how ancient people understood the nature of evil. Sin doesn't simply get forgiven and then forgotten as if it never happened. It has to go somewhere specific. It must be handled, removed, sent far away from where the holy presence dwells. The scapegoat transforms into a container that carries corruption back to where it originated. Think about the geographical aspects of this ritual for a moment. In ancient Near Eastern understanding, Wilderness wasn't just land where nobody happened to live. It represented chaos itself, the complete opposite of order and creation. When divine authority spoke the world into existence, it pushed back against chaos and set up boundaries. The wilderness remained there as a constant reminder of what existed beforehand, a domain where the rules that govern civilization simply don't function. This is the place where Ezel lives, not inside the temple, not among the fields people cultivate, not in the cities where humans gather together and laws keep order. He exists in the in-between spaces, in the shrieking emptiness where demonic entities were thought to wander freely. The passage from Leviticus doesn't bother explaining who Ezel actually is or why the goat gets sent to him. It just states the ritual as an established fact, as though the original readers already had complete understanding. Later Jewish texts from the Second Temple era, writings that held value in ancient Judaism but didn't make it into most contemporary biblical collections, provide more detail about this mysterious figure. These texts describe him as a celestial being who fell, a corrupter of human beings, an entity so incredibly dangerous that he has to stay bound in the wilderness until the final days arrive. What these texts suggest is that the ritual isn't about trying to appease Ezel or presenting him with some kind of offering. Instead, it's about returning sin to the very one who brought it into the world originally. The goat stumbles across the rocky ground, getting driven farther and farther away from where humans live. Ancient sources tell us how the animal would be guided to the edge of a cliff and then pushed over it, making absolutely certain it could never find its way back. This creature carrying the people's sins dies in Ezel's territory, completing the transfer of guilt from the holy community to the domain of chaos and darkness. For centuries, this ritual was performed, repeated year after year by priests who understood they were dealing with powers that went well beyond simple symbolic actions. They weren't just putting on some kind of performance or theater. These people believed something genuinely real occurred when that goat vanished into the wilderness. The community's record was wiped completely clean, and the contamination of sin got removed to the place where it actually belonged. Yet questions remain lurking in the shadows surrounding this ancient ceremony. Who exactly is this Ezel? What's the reason he lives in the wilderness? What gave him the right to receive the sins of all these people? The ritual gives us no answers whatsoever, only the harsh reality of a name that gets spoken once every year, a name connected to darkness, banishment, and the wild territories where humans wouldn't dare to go. The Day of Atonement ritual functions as a doorway into a worldview where the separation between the physical realm and the spiritual realm was considerably thinner than modern thinking usually imagines. That goat wasn't just representing something symbolically. Ezel wasn't simply a metaphor for something else. Something was actually happening out there in that wilderness, something the ancient priests grasped, even though they couldn't completely explain it in words. This ceremony represents our initial glimpse into who Ezel is, but it's merely the starting point. The ritual creates more questions than it provides answers for, pointing us toward a deeper story concealed in ancient texts, a story about rebellion, corruption, and judgment that would echo through hundreds of years of religious tradition. Looking past the ritual, the name's disturbing significance. In the ancient world, names carried actual power within them. They weren't random labels slapped on things, but instead revealed the fundamental essence of whatever they described. When parents gave a child a name, they were speaking destiny over that child's life. When divine beings received their names, those names held clues about their essential nature and their purpose. So when we come across the name Ezel, we need to ask ourselves what it reveals about this wilderness dweller. The Hebrew letters forming Azazel have created debate among scholars for many generations. The name shows up in ancient texts without any explanation, as though the people originally reading these texts didn't need an introduction. Still, what it means remains disputed, with each suggested translation opening up a different window into his nature. One way to interpret it reads the name as God strengthens or strength of God. This translation appears almost ironic when you apply it to a being who's associated with sin and desolate places. Yet it points to something important, that Ezel once held divine power. The name hints at where he came from, pointing back to a time before he became associated with darkness and banishment. A different reading translates Ezel as fierce God or strong God. This interpretation emphasizes raw, unrestrained power, the sort of force that operates outside moral boundaries. It suggests a being with immense capabilities, someone who channels divine strength toward goals that oppose the established order. The fierce quality implied here matches perfectly with the terror people associate with the wilderness, where nature functions without any mercy or compromise. Perhaps the most convincing translation reads, Azil as goat demon, or the goat that departs. This interpretation connects directly to the scapegoat ritual, creating a meaning that circles back on itself. The goat goes to the goat demon, you see. Sin returns to the one who's associated with where it originated. This reading suggests Azel's identity became so deeply intertwined with the ritual that his name and the ceremony basically merged into a single concept. The way the name is structured linguistically gives us additional clues. It combines two separate elements, which is a pattern you commonly find in Hebrew names. The first part, Az, relates to strength, fierceness, or roughness. The second part, El, refers to God or divine power. This combination creates tension right inside the name itself, joining raw, untamed force together with the divine realm. Some ancient interpreters read the name as removal of God, or God removes. This translation frames Azel as the mechanism of divine separation, the means through which the holy pushes away whatever cannot coexist with purity. It positions him not as some independent rebel, but as a necessary opposite, the place where rejected things have to go. The ambiguity that surrounds the name reflects a deeper reality about Azel's nature. He exists in the spaces between clear categories, not quite a god, not quite a demon, not fully explained by the texts that mention him. The uncertainty built into his name mirrors the uncertainty surrounding his role in the cosmic order. Ancient Near Eastern languages offer parallel concepts that shed light on Azel's nature. Other cultures in the region spoke about wilderness spirits, demons who inhabited the desolate places beyond human control. These beings were associated with chaos, sickness, and the dangers that lurked outside civilization's protective boundaries. Azel fits this pattern while also standing apart, connected specifically to the community's moral pollution rather than general misfortune. The name appears in texts from different time periods, and how it was used evolved over the centuries. Early references treat it almost casually, assuming readers understand the reference. Later writings expand on the name, connecting it to stories about fallen angels and cosmic rebellion. This evolution suggests Azel's identity grew more complex over time, absorbing related traditions and concepts. Consider how the name would have sounded to ancient ears. When the high priest spoke Azel over the goat on the Day of Atonement, the syllables carried real weight. The crowd would have understood they were invoking something real, something powerful, something dwelling in the wilderness beyond their borders. The name itself became a verbal boundary marker, distinguishing the realm of holiness from the realm of exile. The phonetic qualities of the name matter as well. The repeated Z sounds create a harsh, almost hissing quality. It's not a gentle name, not comforting or warm. It sounds like wind blowing through rocky canyons, like the scrape of stone against stone, like the territory it describes. Different translations of ancient texts render the name in various ways. Some transliterate it directly as Azel. Others attempt to translate its meaning, calling him the scapegoat or the one who removes. Still others leave it as a proper name, treating it as referring to a specific being rather than a general concept. Each choice reflects an interpretive decision about what Azel fundamentally is. The name's etymology connects to concepts of strength and ruggedness, qualities associated with the wilderness landscape itself. Rocky cliffs, harsh sun, unforgiving terrain where only the strongest survive. Azel's name links him permanently to this environment, suggesting he doesn't merely inhabit the wilderness, but embodies it, represents it, rules it. Beyond its linguistic components, the name carries emotional resonance. It sounds foreign, other, separate from the familiar names of prophets and patriarchs. It belongs to the realm beyond the known world, marking the boundary between sacred space and dangerous territory. When ancient listeners heard this name, they understood they were approaching something that existed outside normal categories of understanding. The scholarly debates about the name's meaning reveal something important. After thousands of years, we still aren't certain what it means. This uncertainty isn't a weakness in the historical record, but a feature of Azel's nature. He remains partially obscured, his true essence hidden behind multiple possible meanings, each one true in its own way. The name itself becomes a mystery appropriate for a being whose story unfolds in shadows and wilderness places. The celestial guardians come down, the rebellion before the flood. Long before the great flood washed the world clean, before humanity spread across the earth in its current form, divine beings watched over creation. These weren't distant, detached observers. They were the watchers, angels assigned to guard and guide the unfolding of mortal life. Their eyes tracked human development, and their role was to observe without interfering, to witness without becoming entangled in the affairs of flesh and blood. The Book of Enoch, a text revered in Second Temple Judaism, though not included in most modern scriptural collections, preserves this account. It describes a time when the boundary between heaven and earth was more permeable, when angels moved between realms with greater freedom. The watchers stationed themselves at their appointed places, maintaining vigilance over the world below. Mount Hermon rises in the northern mountainous regions, its snow-capped peaks visible from great distances. The mountain stands as a natural boundary marker, a place where earth reaches toward heaven. According to the Enochic tradition, this mountain became the site of a momentous gathering. 200 watchers assembled on its summit and made a collective decision that would reshape the course of human history. According to the Enochic account preserved in the Book of Enoch, these angels weren't acting on impulse. The text describes how they discussed among themselves, weighing their options and considering the consequences. They saw the daughters of humanity, and something shifted within them. Desire awakened where it shouldn't exist. They looked at mortal women and saw beauty, and that beauty called to something deep within their being. The leader of this assembly was named Shemhaza, though his story intertwines with Azel's in complex ways. Shemhaza proposed a pact. The angels would descend together, binding themselves through oath to ensure no single watcher could back out once the decision was made. They understood the gravity of what they planned. They knew it violated their assigned role. The oath they swore on Mount Hermon carried tremendous weight. In the ancient world, oaths invoked divine witness and called down curses on those who broke their word. These angels bound themselves through mutual cursing, agreeing that each would share the guilt and consequences of their collective action. No one could claim innocence or ignorance. Later, 200 angels descended from Mount Hermon. They left their positions as observers and entered directly into human affairs. The text names their leaders, preserving the identity of those who led the rebellion. Names like Shemhaza, Azul, Araba, Ramil, Kokabal. Each name carried its own meaning, its own connection to divine authority now turned toward unauthorized purposes. The Watchers' original purpose had been noble. They were meant to guard humanity, to watch over the development of mortal civilization without interference. They represented divine care, the attention of heaven directed toward earth. But somewhere in their watching, the boundary eroded. Observation became fascination. Fascination became desire. Desire became action. This descent marked a fundamental violation of cosmic order. Angels belonged to the heavenly realm, humans to the earthly. These categories weren't merely descriptive, but prescriptive, establishing proper boundaries for different orders of being. When the Watchers crossed from heaven to earth with intent to marry mortal women, they shattered a boundary that was meant to remain firm. The decision didn't happen suddenly. The Enochic text suggests a process of consideration and deliberation. The Watchers saw what was happening in human society, saw the beauty and vitality of mortal life, and something within them yearned to participate rather than merely observe. This yearning grew until it overwhelmed their assigned purpose. Mount Hermon itself becomes significant in this account. Mountains in ancient cosmology represented places where heaven and earth drew close to each other. They were liminal spaces, thresholds between realms. The choice of this mountain for the Watcher's oath wasn't random. They gathered at a place already associated with divine human connection, but they twisted that connection toward unauthorized ends. The text preserves a sense of tragic inevitability about this descent. Once the oath was sworn, once the decision was made collective and binding, there was no turning back. The angels who bound themselves through mutual cursing were now committed to a path that would lead to judgment and destruction. Their unity, which might have been noble in service of their original purpose, became the mechanism of their downfall. The number 200 matters. This wasn't a small group of rebels or a handful of rogue angels. It represented a significant portion of the heavenly host assigned to watch over humanity. The rebellion had scale and organization. It was coordinated, planned, deliberate. This wasn't passion overcoming reason in a moment of weakness. It was a calculated decision made by beings who understood divine law and chose to break it anyway. The Watchers' descent set in motion a cascade of consequences that would require divine intervention to address. They didn't simply take human wives and settle into mortal life. Their presence and actions introduced corruption into the world in ways that would multiply and spread. Each Watcher contributed to this corruption in different ways, but they all shared responsibility for the initial violation. Some ancient readers of this text saw the Watchers' fall as an explanation for evil's origin in the world. Humanity had turned away from the Creator before, but the Watchers' rebellion introduced a new dimension of corruption. It brought forbidden knowledge, unnatural offspring, and systematic violence into human experience. The pre-flood world became increasingly chaotic and dangerous as a result. The account resonates with deep questions about free will and cosmic order. These angels weren't created evil. They were assigned a purpose and given the capacity to fulfill it. Yet they chose differently. Their choice demonstrates that even beings of greater power and knowledge than humans can turn away from their proper role. The capacity for rebellion exists across different orders of being. Mount Hermon stands today much as it did millennia ago, its peaks rising above the surrounding landscape. Ancient traditions preserve the memory of what happened there, and the mountain became associated with the beginning of angelic corruption, the place where heaven and earth should have met in harmony. Instead, it became the launching point for cosmic rebellion. The Watcher story is one of squandered purpose. They were given an important role, entrusted with significant responsibility, granted proximity to both divine and human realms. Instead of faithfully fulfilling their assignment, they chose to abandon it for immediate gratification. Their descent from Mount Hermon marked the beginning of a story that would end in judgment, imprisonment, and eternal condemnation. Azel's transgression, the instructor of prohibited wisdom. Among the 200 Watchers who descended from Mount Hermon, Azel stood apart. While his companions pursued mortal women and violated the boundary between angel and human through marriage, Azel's corruption took a different form. His sin wasn't primarily about desire or breaking divine-human separation. His crime was teaching, and what he taught would poison human civilization in ways that persist to this day. The Book of Enoch provides specific details about Azel's actions. He taught men the art of metalwork, showing them how to extract ore from the earth and forge it into weapons. Before Azel's instruction, humanity possessed basic tools and simple implements. After his teaching, they gained the knowledge to create swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. The technology of warfare entered the world through his lessons. Consider what this knowledge represented. Metal weapons changed everything about human conflict. Before them, disputes might be settled through strength or simple weapons made of wood and stone. After them, one person could end another's life with terrible efficiency. The scale of violence increased dramatically. What Azel taught wasn't merely a craft, but a capacity for destruction that transformed human society. But his teaching didn't stop with weapons. Azel also revealed the secrets of mining and metallurgy, showing humans how to work with different metals for various purposes. He taught the extraction and processing of copper, iron, silver, and gold. These weren't merely practical skills. They represented knowledge that angels possessed about the structure of creation, information about the earth's hidden treasures that humanity wasn't meant to access yet. The text specifically mentions how Azel taught women the art of cosmetics and beautification. He showed them how to use antimony to darken their eyes, how to employ precious stones and colored materials for adornment. This teaching might seem less dangerous than weapons, but the Enochic author considered it part of the same corruption. It introduced vanity, deception, and artificial enhancement of natural beauty. It encouraged people to present false appearances rather than reveal their true nature. Azel also taught the knowledge of dyes and the coloring of fabric. Before his instruction, Clothing served basic purposes of protection and modesty. After his teaching, garments became tools of status, display, and seduction. The ability to create vibrant colors and elaborate clothing transformed social dynamics, introducing hierarchy and envy based on appearance. Each piece of knowledge Azil shared had consequences that rippled through human civilization. The weapons led to increased violence and warfare. The cosmetics and dyes fed vanity and deception. The metallurgy gave humans access to materials and techniques that accelerated their development beyond what was intended for that stage of their existence. Azazel essentially forced humanity through a premature technological revolution. The Enochic text frames this teaching as a profound violation. Knowledge has its proper time and place. Azil revealed information before humanity was ready to handle it responsibly. Like giving fire to children, he provided capabilities without the wisdom to use them appropriately. The result was predictable. Humans took what they learned and employed it in ways that increased suffering and corruption. Think about how metallurgy would have appeared to people who had never seen it before. The ability to extract metal from rock, to heat it until it became liquid, to shape it into tools and weapons, would seem almost magical. Azil was sharing something from the divine realm, secret knowledge about how the world worked at a fundamental level. This wasn't meant for human understanding, not yet. The weapons Azil taught humans to create had immediate effects. Violence escalated. Conflicts that might have ended with bruises now ended with graves. The strong had always dominated the weak, but now the armed could dominate everyone else. The introduction of metallurgical warfare technology restructured human society around organized violence in ways that hadn't existed before. Azil's teaching about cosmetics and adornment wasn't merely about vanity. It introduced the concept of masking, of presenting a false face to the world. The natural distinctions between people became obscured by artificial enhancement. Beauty, which had been a matter of genetics and health, became something that could be purchased and applied. This shift had profound social implications. The text connects all these teachings to a single source, Azil. While other watchers contributed to human corruption through their offspring or other revelations, Azil's specific crime was this transfer of forbidden knowledge. He became the prototype of the tempter, who offers knowledge that shouldn't be possessed, power that corrupts rather than elevates. What makes Azil's sin particularly insidious is its permanence. The watchers who took human wives produced children who eventually perished in the flood. But the knowledge Azil taught couldn't be forgotten once learned. Humanity carried it forward across generations. The techniques of metalwork, the understanding of cosmetics and dyes, the capacity to forge weapons, all of this persisted even after the watchers were judged and imprisoned. The text suggests Azil knew what he was doing. This wasn't accidental knowledge transfer or innocent teaching. He deliberately revealed information that he understood would corrupt human society. His motivation remained somewhat obscure, but the effect was clear. He accelerated human development in ways that increased their capacity for violence and deception. Ancient readers would have seen in Azil's teaching an explanation for aspects of their world that seemed problematic. Why do humans have the capacity to create such terrible weapons? Why does vanity and deception come so naturally? Why do we possess knowledge that we often use destructively? The Enochic answer: because a fallen angel taught us these things before we were ready to handle them. Azil's role as teacher distinguishes him from the other watchers. Shemhaza violated divine order through sexual transgression. Azil violated it through pedagogical transgression. He passed knowledge across a boundary that should have remained firm. In some ways, his sin was more subtle than Shemhaza's, but equally profound in its consequences. The specific combination of what Azil taught reveals a pattern: weapons for violence, cosmetics for deception, metallurgy for manipulation of the natural world. Each area of knowledge he revealed gave humans greater power to act against each other and against the intended order of creation. He wasn't teaching them to grow better crops or build stronger homes. He taught them to make war and to deceive. The Shemhaza connection, a partnership in evil. The story of the Watcher's rebellion isn't a simple tale with a single villain. While Azil's corruption of humanity through forbidden teaching stands as a particular crime, It occurred within a larger pattern of angelic transgression led by another figure, Shemhaza, the chief of the fallen Watchers. Understanding the relationship between these two provides crucial context for grasping the full scope of angelic rebellion. Shemhaza's name appears first in the Enochic lists of rebel angels. He organized the assembly on Mount Hermon where the Watchers swore their binding oath. In the hierarchy of this rebellion, he functioned as the primary leader, the one who proposed the initial descent and convinced others to join him. His authority among the Watchers made him responsible for initiating the violation that would lead to widespread corruption. Where Azel's sin involved teaching forbidden knowledge, Shemhaza's crime centered on violating the boundary between divine and human through sexual union. He and the angels following him took human women as wives, producing offspring that were never meant to exist. According to the Enochic interpretation, these unions represented a fundamental confusion of categories, a mixing of what should have remained separate. The offspring of these unions became known as the Nephilim, often translated as giants. Though the term carries implications beyond mere size, these beings inherited power from their angelic fathers and mortality from their human mothers, creating a hybrid existence that fit nowhere in the created order. They belonged to neither the heavenly nor the earthly realm, existing as anomalies that disrupted the natural functioning of creation. Shemhaza's leadership role meant he bore primary responsibility for the Watchers' descent. The text portrays him suggesting the idea to the others. Recognizing their shared desire and proposing collective action, he understood that individual dissent would likely lead to individual punishment, but a group action might provide protection through numbers. His suggestion of a binding oath revealed both his cunning and his miscalculation about divine justice. The relationship between Shemhaza and Azazel represents two different but complementary forms of corruption. Shemhaza corrupted the order of being through inappropriate mixing of angel and human. Azel corrupted human development through premature revelation of knowledge. Together, their actions attacked creation from two directions, through what humans were and through what humans knew. Think of it as a two-pronged assault on the divine plan. Shemhaza introduced biological corruption through the Nephilim, creating beings that shouldn't exist and whose violent nature would terrorize humanity. Azel introduced cultural corruption through forbidden knowledge, giving humans capabilities they would use destructively. Both forms of corruption fed off each other, creating a spiral of increasing chaos in the pre-flood world. The Nephilim giants became a plague upon the earth. Their strength and appetites exceeded those of normal humans. The text describes how they consumed all that humans had produced, then turned to devouring the humans themselves. These hybrid beings operated without restraint, their mixed nature leaving them with power but no proper place in the moral order. They became agents of violence and devastation. Shemhaza also taught forbidden knowledge, though the specific content differed from Azazel's teachings. He revealed enchantments and root-cutting, knowledge related to magic and manipulation of natural forces through occult means. This teaching paralleled Azel's revelations, showing that multiple Watchers were sharing information that humans weren't meant to possess. The other named Watchers each contributed their own specific corruptions. Arakoba taught the signs of the earth. Ramil taught astronomy. Kokabel revealed the constellations. Ezekiel taught knowledge of clouds. Each angel shared information from the divine perspective that humans could access but shouldn't have received through angelic teaching. The pattern established by Shemhaza and Azel spread among their companions. What united Shemhaza and Azel was their understanding that breaking one divine law made breaking others easier. Once the boundary between heaven and earth was violated through dissent, once the oath binding the Watchers was sworn, additional violations followed naturally. The initial transgression opened the door for subsequent corruptions. The text preserves tension between these two figures without fully resolving it. Shemhaza led the initial descent and bore responsibility for the organization of rebellion. Azazel's specific teachings, however, received particular emphasis and condemnation. Both were guilty, but their guilt took different forms and would lead to different punishments. Shemhaza showed awareness of the consequences of his actions. Later portions of the Enochic text describe his distress when he understood divine judgment was coming. He saw the dreams and visions of the Nephilim, understanding they prophesied destruction. His earlier confidence gave way to recognition that his scheme had failed and punishment would follow. The partnership between these two fallen watchers demonstrates how evil operates through cooperation and division of labor. Shemhaza provided leadership and organization. Azel provided specific expertise in corrupting humanity through education. Together, they accomplished what neither could have achieved alone, a comprehensive corruption of the pre-flood world that would require divine intervention to address. Their rebellion wasn't motivated by hatred of humanity or desire to oppose the divine directly. Rather, it sprang from desire for human women in Shemhaza's case and for the satisfaction of sharing forbidden knowledge in Azel's. This makes their sin more tragic in some ways. They fell not from malice, but from following impulses that should have been restrained. The offspring of Shemhaza and the other watchers created immediate problems. The Nephilim consumed resources, committed violence, and spread fear. But Azel's teaching created problems that would outlast the Nephilim themselves. The knowledge couldn't be unlearned once humanity possessed it. This made Azel's corruption in some ways more lasting than Shemhaza's. Both angels understood they were violating divine order, yet they proceeded anyway. The text emphasizes their deliberation and planning, showing this wasn't impulsive action but calculated rebellion. They weighed the risks and decided the satisfaction of their desires outweighed the certainty of punishment. This choice defines them both, linking them forever in the story of angelic fall. The connection between Shemhaza and Azel reveals something important about the nature of systematic evil. It rarely comes from a single source or takes a single form. Instead, different corruptions work together, reinforcing and amplifying each other. The biological corruption through the Nephilim and the cultural corruption through forbidden knowledge combined to create a world so damaged that it required the drastic solution of the flood to cleanse it. Violence spread across the earth like a plague. The metalwork techniques Azel had taught were perfected into instruments of war. Swords clashed in valleys that had once known only peace. Armor was forged in fires that burned day and night. The art of warfare, once unknown to humanity, became the dominant pursuit of entire generations. Communities that had lived in harmony for centuries now fortified their settlements and trained their young for battle. The boundary between the seen and unseen worlds had been shattered, and chaos reigned in both realms. The cosmic consequences, chaos on earth and in heaven. The world began to crumble under the weight of forbidden knowledge. What the Watchers had set in motion could not be contained. Their descent to Mount Hermon had seemed like a singular act of rebellion, but the consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone cast into still water. Each ripple grew larger, more violent, until the very fabric of creation trembled. The children born from the union of Watchers and human women were unlike anything the earth had seen. The Book of Enoch describes these Nephilim as giants, beings of immense size and insatiable hunger. They consumed the produce of the fields until nothing remained. They devoured the livestock until the herds were empty. Then they turned their appetite toward humanity itself. These giants walked the earth as living catastrophes, and their presence alone brought suffering to every corner of the ancient lands. Beyond their physical destruction, the Nephilim carried something darker within them. They were born of a union that violated the divine order, a mixing of heavenly and earthly that was never meant to be. Their very existence corrupted the natural world. The knowledge their fathers had taught, the weapons Azel had revealed, the sorceries and enchantments the other Watchers had shared, now belonged to these hybrid beings. They wielded this forbidden wisdom with neither restraint nor mercy. When these giants eventually perished, according to the text, their spirits would not simply cease to exist. The Book of Enoch describes how the spirits of the slain Nephilim became evil spirits upon the earth, entities that would wander the world, oppressing humanity and spreading corruption even after their physical forms had fallen. The cries of humanity rose to heaven like smoke from a burning city. The Book of Enoch records that 4 archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, heard these cries and brought them before the Most High. The prayers of the suffering reached the divine throne room. The earth itself seemed to groan under the burden of violence and bloodshed. Creation, which had been declared good, now writhed in agony. The divine response was inevitable. The Most High looked upon the corruption and pronounced judgment. The Watchers had broken their covenant. They had abandoned their stations and corrupted the order of heaven and earth. Their punishment would be severe, but more than that, it would be permanent. There would be no redemption, no second chance, no pathway back to their former glory. The judgment would unfold in stages. First, the Watchers themselves would be dealt with, bound and imprisoned before the greater cleansing could begin. They were not mortal beings who could simply be washed away by water. They were eternal creatures who had chosen rebellion. Their punishment would need to match their nature. Only after they were secured would the flood be ordained, the waters rising to cleanse the earth of the violence that had consumed it. The Nephilim would be swept away, their bodies returned to the dust from which all flesh came. Each archangel received specific instructions. Michael was commanded to bind Shem-Hazah and the Watchers who had followed him. Gabriel was sent to destroy the Nephilim, to set them against one another until they consumed themselves in violence. Uriel was tasked with warning Noah and preserving a remnant of humanity through the coming deluge, and Raphael received the charge concerning Azazel. The cosmic consequences of the Watchers' rebellion extended beyond mere physical destruction. They had introduced a fundamental disorder into creation itself, the separation between heaven and earth, between divine and mortal, between sacred knowledge and human understanding. All these boundaries had been violated. The restoration of order would require more than simply removing the Nephilim. It would require addressing the source of corruption, the teachers who had poisoned humanity with forbidden wisdom. The earth had become a battleground between the forces of order and chaos. Every valley, every mountain, every settlement bore the scars of this conflict. The ancient lands knew no peace. Families buried their loved ones in soil soaked with blood. Fields that should have yielded grain grew nothing but thorns. Rivers ran red with the aftermath of violence. The world that had been created with such care and intention now teetered on the edge of complete collapse. Heaven's patience had reached its limit. The time for judgment had arrived. The archangels descended with their divine mandate, each carrying out their assigned task with precision. The machinery of cosmic justice began to turn, and nothing would remain unchanged. The Watchers would face the consequences of their choices. The earth would be purified, and Azazel, the teacher of warfare and corruption, would receive a punishment designed specifically for his crimes. The archangel's mission, Raphael's charge against Azazel. Among the 4 archangels who stood before the divine throne, Raphael received perhaps the most specific and terrible commission. While his fellow archangels were sent to bind groups of Watchers or to orchestrate the destruction of the Nephilim, Raphael's task was singular and personal. He was sent for one being alone, Azazel. The Book of Enoch preserves the exact words of this divine command. The Most High spoke directly to Raphael, saying, "Bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness." This was not a general order given to all the angels. This was a targeted judgment against a specific rebel. Azazel had earned a punishment distinct from his fellow Watchers, a fate tailored to his particular crimes. The command carried weight beyond its simple words. Binding hand and foot was not merely about physical restraint. For a being of Azazel's power, a creature who had walked in the heavenly courts and possessed knowledge beyond human comprehension, this binding represented total humiliation. His hands, which had taught humanity to forge weapons of war, would be rendered useless. His feet, which had descended from the heights of heaven to corrupt the earth, would walk no more. Raphael descended from the divine presence with his orders clear. He was to find Azazel, bind him completely, and transport him to a specific location in the wilderness. The place was called Dudal, a name that carries its own dark resonance in the Enochic tradition. This was not a random prison. The location itself mattered. The wilderness, the desert, the desolate places, these were Azazel's domain, and now they would become his eternal cage. The text specifies that Raphael should make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudal. A pit was to be prepared, a hole torn in the earth itself. This opening would serve as Azazel's tomb, his prison, his eternal dwelling place. The archangel was instructed to cast the fallen Watcher into this darkness and cover him with rough, jagged stones. The weight of the earth itself would hold him down. More than physical imprisonment awaited Azazel. The command specified that he should dwell there forever. This was not a temporary confinement until some future parole hearing. This was permanent exile from the world above. The being who had once stood in the presence of the divine, who had served in the celestial courts, would now spend eternity in absolute darkness, beneath layers of stone and earth. The text adds a detail that deepens the horror of this punishment. Cover his face that he may not see light. Darkness was not merely the nature of Azel's surroundings. It was forced upon him, imposed upon his very face. The light of heaven, the light of creation, the light that represents divine presence, all of this would be cut off from him completely. He would exist in a void, unable to see, unable to move, unable to exercise any of the power he once possessed. Raphael's mission carried a prophetic dimension as well. The command stated that Azel should remain bound until the day of the great judgment. His imprisonment in Doodle was not his final punishment. It was merely the holding period before something worse. On that ultimate day of divine justice, Azel would be led forth from his desert prison and cast into fire. The binding was temporary, in the sense that it preceded an even more severe eternal judgment. The archangel's task also included a restorative purpose. The text explains that binding Azel would allow the whole earth, which has been corrupted by the works that Azel taught, to be healed. His removal from the world was necessary for creation's restoration. As long as he remained free, his influence would continue to poison the earth. Only by cutting him off completely could the damage he had caused begin to be repaired. Raphael carried out his mission with divine authority. The text does not describe a battle or struggle. There is no account of Azel fighting against his captor or attempting to escape. The archangel's power, backed by the authority of the Most High, was absolute. Azel, despite all his knowledge and all his corruption of humanity, was helpless before the divine judgment that came for him. The binding of Azel stands as one of the most vivid and specific punishments described in the Enochic literature. While other watchers were bound as a group, while the Nephilim were destroyed through mutual violence, Azel alone received this particular form of imprisonment. His crimes had been specific: teaching warfare, revealing forbidden knowledge, corrupting humanity with weapons and vanity, and therefore his punishment was equally specific. He would be buried in the very wilderness he had claimed as his domain. Unable to teach, unable to corrupt, unable even to see the world he had ruined. The punishment in Dudale, imprisoned in the desert. The desert of Dudale stretched endlessly under a merciless sun. Sand and stone, heat and emptiness. This was the landscape of desolation, the place where living things came to perish. In this wasteland, far from any settlement, beyond the reach of any human path, Raphael brought his prisoner. The archangel's work began with tearing open the earth itself. The ground split under divine command, revealing a pit that descended into absolute darkness. This was no natural cave or formation. This was a wound in the earth, carved specifically to hold one being. The opening yawned like a mouth ready to swallow the fallen watcher whole. Azel was cast into this darkness, his body plummeting into the depths. The being who had once moved freely between heaven and earth now fell into the earth's embrace. He descended past layers of rock and sand, past the roots of ancient stones, into a depth where no light had ever reached. The walls closed around him, tight and pressing. As he reached the bottom of his prison, Raphael followed the divine instructions with precision. He bound Azel's hands behind him, wrists crossed and secured with bonds that would never loosen. He bound his feet together, ankle to ankle, removing any possibility of movement. The fallen teacher of warfare, who had shown humanity how to forge and wield weapons, now could not even lift his arms. His hands, once used to demonstrate the crafting of swords and shields, were rendered completely useless. The covering of his face came next. Raphael placed something over Azel's eyes, blocking out even the faint light that might have filtered down from above. Complete darkness enveloped him. The last thing Azel would have seen before the darkness fell was perhaps the face of his captor, the archangel carrying out heaven's judgment. Then, nothing. Only black void stretching eternally before unseeing eyes. Jagged stones came next. The text specifies rough, sharp rocks, not smooth river stones or carefully placed slabs, but broken cutting edges that pressed against the prisoner's body. Raphael piled these stones upon Azel, layer after layer, creating a crushing weight. Each stone added to the burden, pressing down, making movement impossible, ensuring that even if the bonds somehow failed, The sheer mass of rock would hold the fallen watcher in place. The opening was sealed. Earth and stone filled the pit's mouth, erasing any trace of the prison below. The desert surface showed no sign of what lay beneath. To any traveler who might pass this way, though few ever would, there would be nothing to see. Just another stretch of desolate wilderness, empty and lifeless, offering no hint of the terrible prisoner buried far below. Time lost meaning in that darkness. Days passed, then weeks, then years, then centuries, at least above ground in the world of light and movement. Below, in the pit, everything was static. The text gives no indication of mercy, no suggestion of sleep or unconsciousness that might grant relief. Azel simply remained bound and blind, feeling the weight of stones pressing against him, breathing air that tasted of dust and darkness. Whether his awareness continued unbroken or faded into something else, we cannot know. The prison in Dudil became his entire existence, and that existence stretched toward an ending that would not come until the final judgment. The location itself carried significance beyond mere geography. Dudil, according to various interpretations of the Enigmatic text, was not simply any desert. This was the wilderness, the place of demons, the realm of chaos that existed beyond the ordered world of human civilization. By imprisoning Azel here, the judgment placed him back in the domain he had claimed. The desert demon was returned to the desert, but now as a prisoner rather than a ruler. The symbolism ran even deeper. Throughout ancient Near Eastern tradition, the wilderness represented the opposite of civilization, the anti-place where order broke down and chaos reigned. Demons and evil spirits were believed to dwell in these desolate regions. By binding Azel in Dudil, the judgment acknowledged his nature while simultaneously neutralizing his power. He remained a desert demon, but one stripped of all ability to harm or corrupt. The connection to the scapegoat ritual became impossible to ignore. In Leviticus, the goat bearing the sins of the people was sent into the wilderness, specifically to Azel. Now, the Enochic tradition revealed where that goat was truly going, to the prison of the fallen watcher who bore that name. The yearly ritual was not sending sin into a void, but returning it to its source, to the one imprisoned for teaching humanity how to sin in the first place. Azel's consciousness remained intact through the long centuries. He could think, remember, and presumably feel regret, or perhaps continued defiance. The text does not describe his inner state, his thoughts, or emotions during this imprisonment. What we can imagine of his experience must remain speculation, though the horror of the situation needs no elaboration. The being who had taught humanity to see and understand things they were never meant to know now saw nothing. The one who had taught them to forge and fight could not move his own hands. The contrast between what he had been and what he had become defined the severity of his punishment. The desert above continued its eternal rhythm. The winds swept over the desert sands, moving dunes and wiping out every trace. Day after day, the sun climbed and descended, yet its rays never penetrated to the depths far below. The seasons turned, but down in that deep prison, the temperature never wavered. Life on earth continued, healing from the waters of the flood, filling again with people, building fresh civilizations, and during all of this, Azel stayed precisely where Raphael had left him, held fast in Dudil. Whether time passed for him in any meaningful way, whether any form of awareness persisted in that complete blackness, the writings leave unanswered. What stands beyond question is the absolute nature of his confinement, the thoroughness of his restraint, the total impossibility of breaking free. This imprisonment would stretch forward until the day of final reckoning. The writings clarify that this represents not Azel's end, but simply the waiting period. When that great and dreadful day arrives, when every debt gets settled and every wrong receives its answer, Azel would be pulled from his wilderness prison. He would be brought from the darkness of Dudil into a darkness of another kind, into the everlasting flames prepared for him and those who rebelled alongside him. Yet until that moment arrived, the pit out in the wasteland kept him secure. The Day of Atonement revisited. The symbolism of the scapegoat. In the courtyard of the tabernacle, the high priest stood, resting his hands upon the heads of two goats that looked identical. This day, the Day of Atonement, held the greatest solemnity in the entire sacred calendar. The people had assembled, watching in silence while the priest readied himself to carry out the ancient ceremony that would wash away their wrongdoings for one more year. The lots fell. One animal would be offered to the Lord, its blood taken into the holiest chamber to provide atonement. The second goat, however, the one set apart for Azel, faced an entirely different destiny. Upon this living creature's head, the priest would lay his hands and speak over it every sin the people had committed. Each misdeed, each failure, each act of corruption would pass symbolically onto this animal. Following this, the goat would be taken away into the wild lands. A designated man would lead the creature far beyond the settlement, far from any human dwelling, into those barren regions where people did not live. Out there in that empty wasteland, the goat would be set free. It would move off into the desert, bearing the burden of the nation's transgressions, and it would never come back. This creature was the scapegoat, and where it went was to Azel. Through the centuries, those interpreting this faced difficulty with the phrase, what could it possibly mean to send something to Azel? Some proposed it merely named a location, some wilderness spot with no further significance. Others maintained it meant for elimination or for utter destruction, taking the word from linguistic roots suggesting removal or departure. The name surfaced nowhere else in the entire Torah, offering no additional context for clarification. The Book of Enoch supplied what had been missing. When the Enochic tradition laid out Azel's confinement in the wasteland of Dudael, bound underneath rocks in the wilderness, the connection became apparent. The scapegoat wasn't heading into some empty nowhere. It was being directed to the exact location where the desert demon himself lay chained. The sins of the community were being sent back to where they originated. This did not constitute a sacrifice to Azel. The point deserves emphasis. The ceremony wasn't presenting the goat to him the way one might present an offering to a god. The scapegoat never underwent sacrifice. It was released, sent away, expelled. The action meant riddance, not reverence. The people weren't giving honor to Azel, but rather recognizing the link between wrongdoing and the being who first showed humanity how to break the rules. According to the Enochic writings, Azel had brought warfare, weaponry, and vanity to humankind. He taught people how to make themselves beautiful using cosmetics and adornments, how to craft swords and shields, how to participate in violence and moral decay. These lessons had caused sin to multiply across the planet. They had damaged creation itself and triggered divine response. By directing the sign-carrying goat toward Azel, the ceremony symbolically acknowledged the source of these wrongs. The wilderness location tied everything together. Azel's cell stood in the desert, in Dudael, in the desolate territories beyond the reach of civilization. The scapegoat traveled into the wilderness, into that same domain of chaos and breakdown. The two weren't simply connected metaphorically, but joined geographically. The goat bearing the people's wrongdoings journeyed to the very area where the demon who had taught those wrongs lay trapped beneath the ground. In time, rabbinic tradition contributed details that strengthened this connection. In the Mishnah and Talmud, compiled during the early centuries of the Common Era, the scapegoat ceremony grew more complex. The goat wasn't just turned loose, but was conducted to a particular cliff and pushed over its edge, guaranteeing its death in the wasteland. A scarlet cord was bound around its horns, and according to tradition, when the offering found acceptance, this thread would become white, showing divine pardon. These elaborations underscored how final the removal of sin truly was. Certain rabbinic sources directly named Azel as a demonic entity, a wilderness ruler to whom sins were symbolically sent back. The great medieval scholar Rashi, writing in 11th century France, called Azel the name of a demon, describing a severe and rocky mountain. The prominent interpreter Nachmanides, writing in 13th century Spain, explained that the scapegoat went to the location of the harsh and rugged, to the demon ruling over wasted places. These commentators, though writing many centuries past the Second Temple period, knew the Enochic traditions and grasped the ritual's deeper significance. The ritual's placement on the calendar also mattered. The Day of Atonement came once annually, a single moment when 12 months of accumulated wrongdoing received ceremonial expulsion from the community. This wasn't something happening daily or weekly, but rather an annual cleansing, a resetting of the spiritual accounts. By dispatching the scapegoat to Azel's territory each year, the ceremony recognized a continuing truth. Sin, which entered the world through his instruction, required ongoing attention and removal. The symbolism reached into the binding imagery itself. Azel sat bound hand and foot in his desert cell. The scapegoat, in its own way, was likewise bound, carrying an inescapable load of sin upon its head. Neither could escape what they bore. The goat would perish in the wasteland beneath the weight of the people's violations. Azel would stay eternally in the wasteland beneath the weight of heavenly judgment. Both remained captive to sin's consequences. Contemporary readers might view this ceremony as peculiar or disturbing. The concept of moving sin onto an animal, of dispatching it away to a demon's realm, feels alien to modern religious sensibility. Within its original context, however, the ritual carried profound theological meaning. It showed that sin possessed a source, a background, and a fitting destination. It revealed that purging corruption from the community demanded more than inward repentance. It required actively pushing evil back toward the disordered realm from which it emerged. The scapegoat ceremony therefore functioned as a yearly reminder of the Azel narrative. Each year, as the goat moved into the wilderness, the people remembered, even if only faintly, the first rebellion, the sharing of forbidden secrets, humanity's corruption, and the divine response that locked the teacher of sin in the desert forever. The ritual preserved the story, woven into the very structure of their most sacred day. The shift in identity, from fallen angel to desert demon. A change began in how people discussed Azel. The writings from the Second Temple period reveal a slow but clear transformation. The figure who had been one specific rebel, a single member among many watchers, gradually absorbed additional identities. His narrative blended with other accounts of cosmic rebellion. His name attached to progressively darker positions. This transformation didn't occur suddenly. It developed across centuries as Jewish thought engaged with questions about evil's beginning and character. Where did wickedness come from? Who stood against the divine will? What power lurked behind the temptation and decay troubling humanity? These questions required responses, and Azel's narrative offered raw material for theological growth. In the earliest Enochic traditions, Azel remained separate from the Watcher's leader. Shemhaza held that role. He arranged the rebellion. He guided the descent to Mount Hermon. He administered the oath, binding the Watchers together in their violation. Azel's offense differed. He was the instructor, the one revealing forbidden secrets, the being who corrupted humanity's knowledge rather than its bloodlines. As centuries passed, however, these differences started to blur. Certain texts began presenting Azel himself as the chief of the fallen angels. His teaching function, which had been so particular in First Enoch, expanded into a broader position of command over the powers of darkness. The instructor became the prince. The revealer of mysteries became the chief of demons. The reasons for this shift run deep. As Jewish angelology grew more refined during the Second Temple period, pressure existed to streamline the narrative. Multiple fallen angels with separate crimes and separate punishments created a complicated account. A single opponent, one supreme rebel, provided clearer theological framework. Azel's memorable name and his distinct punishment made him a natural choice for this consolidation. The identification with Satan started taking form. In earlier biblical writings, Satan appeared as a separate figure, not necessarily a fallen angel at all, but instead a member of the divine court, whose function was to test and accuse. The book of Job presents Satan as a prosecuting attorney within heaven's courtroom, operating with divine authorization. This Satan wasn't yet the cosmic rebel of later tradition. Over time, these two figures, Azel the fallen watcher and Satan the accuser, started merging in Jewish and early Christian thought. The similarities were striking. Both represented resistance to divine will. Both connected to temptation and corruption. Both played specific parts in leading humanity into error. The theological simplicity of having one ultimate opponent rather than multiple competing forces of evil pushed this merger forward through the centuries. The Apocalypse of Abraham offers clear evidence of this change. In this writing, dated to the 1st or 2nd century, Azel shows up as the tempter attempting to discourage Abraham from presenting his offering to the Most High. He receives the explicit label of disgrace to all human souls, and is described as possessing authority over those engaging in evil. He's no longer simply the imprisoned instructor of warfare, but an active agent of temptation with continuing influence in the world. This development runs parallel to what unfolded in early Christian theology. As the New Testament authors struggled with the nature of evil and opposition to the divine, they drew upon these Second Temple traditions. Scholars can trace how the figure they named Satan, the devil, the adversary, inherited features from multiple earlier sources, including the Azel tradition, the fallen morning star from Isaiah, the serpent in the garden, the leader of rebellious angels, the tempter in the wasteland. All these identities combined in Christian demonology. The desert connection stayed central through all these transformations. Whether called Azel or Satan, the adversary kept his connection to wilderness locations. When Jesus faced temptation, the Gospels position him in the desert. When demons received expulsion, they looked for desolate places to inhabit. The wilderness stayed the territory of chaos, and its ruler, whatever name he carried, represented the forces working against divine order. The binding narrative evolved as well. While First Enoch described Azel's imprisonment as an accomplished fact, later Christian texts started speaking of Satan being bound in the future, during the Messianic age, or at the final judgment. The book of Revelation, written in the late 1st century as part of Christian scripture, describes an angel descending from heaven carrying a chain to bind that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, for 1,000 years. The imagery echoes Raphael's binding of Azel, but now projected into the end times instead of the distant past. This shift from past to future tense reflected evolving theological requirements. If evil remained active in the world, and clearly it did, then the adversary couldn't be fully bound yet. The narrative adjusted. Azel's imprisonment became a pattern for what would eventually happen to Satan at the end of days. The fallen angel's present binding in Dudael became a prototype for the ultimate binding awaiting all forces of evil. The name itself grew less significant than the function. Jewish mystical writings refer to Samael, often identified with Satan, who performs functions similar to Azel's. Christian demonology developed intricate hierarchies of fallen angels with Satan at their summit. Islamic tradition speaks of Iblis, who refused to bow to Adam. All these figures share common heritage with the Azel of First Enoch, inheriting aspects of his narrative while developing in their own directions. What stayed consistent was the core narrative pattern. A celestial being rebels against divine order. This rebel corrupts humanity, teaching forbidden secrets or inspiring disobedience. Divine judgment follows, including imprisonment or expulsion. The rebel continues opposing the divine will from a position of diminished but not eliminated power. This pattern, first clearly articulated in the Azel narrative, became the template for understanding cosmic evil across multiple religious traditions. The desert demon of the scapegoat ceremony had grown into something far beyond his original function. Azel had become not just one fallen angel among many, but an archetype, a symbol, a name carrying the weight of all rebellion against heaven. His narrative provided the story structure that later traditions would use to explain evil's presence in a world created good. The teacher of warfare had taught his final lesson, how to tell the story of the fall. Azel in the Book of Giants, the Dead Sea Scrolls account. For 2,000 years, the caves near the Salt Sea kept their secrets. When shepherds discovered ancient jars in 1947, they brought to light fragments of a world long vanished. Among the scrolls lay pieces of the Book of Giants, a writing that expands the narrative of the Watchers and their monstrous children. These fragments speak of the Nephilim, the giant offspring born from the joining of Watchers and human women. The Book of Giants preserves their dreams, their terrors, and their growing awareness that judgment draws near. Within these broken passages, Azel appears not as the primary figure, but as part of a broader network of fallen beings whose actions brought devastation to the world. The writing names several giant sons specifically. Ohia and Hahia, sons of the Watcher Shemhazah, received disturbing visions during sleep. Another giant, Mahaweh, functions as a messenger between the earthbound Nephilim and their imprisoned fathers. These beings possess enormous strength and stature, yet they stand powerless against the divine decree sealing their destiny. The dreams themselves carry significance and dread. In one fragment, the giants witness a garden full of trees. A figure comes carrying an axe, cutting down every tree except 3. The symbolism proves obvious, even to those experiencing the vision. The trees represent the giants themselves, and the approaching flood will preserve only a remnant of humanity while washing away the corrupted bloodlines. Mahaway travels vast distances to reach Enoch, the righteous scribe who walked with the divine and was taken up before the flood. The giant seeks interpretation of these visions, hoping perhaps for compassion or a way out. Enoch's answer brings no reassurance. The giants and their fathers face inevitable destruction for the violence and corruption they introduced into the world. The Book of Giants presents Azazel as one among many watchers who took part in the rebellion. Unlike the Book of Enoch, which distinguishes him for teaching forbidden secrets, the fragments from the Salt Sea place him within a collective. The Watchers, as a group, corrupted humanity. Their giant offspring filled the world with bloodshed. The entire operation ends in chains and flames. One fragment mentions the Watchers by name, cataloging their offenses. Azazel appears alongside Shemhazah, Asael, and others. Each carries responsibility for particular violations, yet all participate in the final punishment. The writing emphasizes the breadth of their rebellion rather than highlighting individual actions. The giants themselves emerge as tragic figures in these passages. Born of forbidden unions, they possess neither the immortality of angels nor the mortality of humans. They exist in an in-between space, creatures of tremendous power who nevertheless cannot avoid their decreed end. Their dreams show an awareness of divine justice closing around them. Enoch functions as the connection between worlds in this account. He alone can interpret the signs and deliver messages between the condemned and the divine. His presence in the Book of Giants reinforces the wider Enochic tradition, where this single righteous figure stands as witness to the Watcher's fall and the purging that must come after. The fragmentary condition of these scrolls creates gaps in the narrative. Scholars reconstruct story threads from broken phrases and incomplete sentences. Yet even in fragments, the Book of Giants adds dimension to the tradition. It reveals the consequences of the Watcher's rebellion playing out across generations, affecting not just humanity, but also the monstrous children who inherit their father's guilt. The caves preserved these writings through centuries of silence. When the community that valued these scrolls vanished, the stories remained, waiting in darkness. Voices that spoke of giants and angels, of visions and judgment, of a time when heaven and earth mixed in ways that broke creation's order. Azazel's presence in these fragments connects the Dead Sea community to the broader tradition of Enochic literature. The people who copied and safeguarded these writings believed in the reality of the Watcher's fall. They saw in these ancient accounts a warning about corruption and divine judgment, themes that resonated with their own expectations of coming transformation. The Book of Giants fills in details the Book of Enoch leaves unexplored. While Enoch concentrates on the Watchers and their punishment, the Book of Giants gives voice to their offspring. These giant beings, caught between worlds, face annihilation for sins they inherited rather than chose. Their narrative adds layers of tragedy to the flood story. The scrolls also show how these traditions evolved and spread. Communities across different regions maintained versions of these writings, adapting them to their contexts while preserving core elements. Azazel's story traveled through time and space, carried by scribes who saw in his fall a mirror of ongoing struggles between righteousness and rebellion. When we read these fragments today, we encounter a worldview where spiritual forces actively shape human history. The Watchers descend, they corrupt. Giants walk the earth. Dreams carry messages from the divine realm. Judgment approaches with the certainty of rising water. In this framework, Azazel represents one thread in a complex tapestry of cosmic rebellion and restoration, the Apocalypse of Abraham. Azazel as the great tempter. A different writing casts Azazel in fresh light. The Apocalypse of Abraham, written sometime in the 1st or 2nd century, transforms him from imprisoned watcher into active adversary. Here Azazel meets the patriarch Abraham at a critical moment, attempting to derail the divine plan through temptation and deception. The writing opens with Abraham rejecting the idols of his father, Terah. He recognizes the pointlessness of worshiping carved images and begins his journey toward the one true God. At this moment of spiritual awakening, the divine summons Abraham to prepare a sacrifice on a mountaintop. The ceremony requires particular animals and strict preparation. Abraham obeys. As Abraham climbs the mountain with the sacrificial animals, An unclean bird descends repeatedly upon the carcasses. Abraham drives it away again and again, but it keeps returning with stubborn determination. The bird speaks with a human voice, revealing itself as something far more dangerous than it appears. This is Azel, though Abraham doesn't yet know the name. The creature tries to dissuade Abraham from completing the sacrifice. It questions why Abraham bothers with such effort, suggesting he turn back from this path. The voice carries subtle poison, planting doubt about the worthiness of Abraham's mission. Abraham rejects these whispers. He recognizes the unclean nature of the bird and refuses to listen to its counsel. The creature reveals more of its identity through their exchange. It claims a kind of authority, speaking as one who has power over humanity's sacrifices and offerings. The implication becomes obvious. This being sees itself as a rival to the divine, competing for human devotion and worship. An angel arrives to identify the tempter fully. The angel names him Azel, the disgrace and shame of all creation. The writing describes him as one whose portion consists of those who practice wickedness and who belongs among the stars. This cosmic positioning elevates Azel beyond a simple demon. He holds domain over the corrupted part of creation itself. The angel commands Azel to leave, declaring that Abraham belongs to the divine, not to the ruler of the fallen realm. Azel must return to his proper place beneath the earth, among the roots of the underworld. The confrontation establishes a clear hierarchy. The tempter possesses power, but that power remains subordinate to divine authority. Azel receives another title in this writing that carries tremendous weight. He is called the Lord of Hell, the one who rules over the realm where the wicked find their final home. This represents a significant development from earlier traditions. No longer merely an imprisoned watcher awaiting judgment, Azel now actively governs the domain of punishment and corruption. The Apocalypse of Abraham presents Azel as the embodiment of temptation itself. His method mirrors the serpent in Eden: plant doubt, offer alternative paths, question the divine command. Yet Abraham withstands where humanity's first ancestors failed. The patriarch's resistance demonstrates that humans can reject the tempter's voice when they stay firm in their commitment to the divine. This writing bridges multiple traditions. It draws on the Enochic understanding of Azel as a fallen watcher. It incorporates the Levitical association with sin and the wilderness. Yet it adds new dimensions, casting Azel as an active spiritual adversary who encounters specific individuals at pivotal moments in salvation history. The timing of Abraham's encounter matters. At the very beginning of the covenant relationship between God and humanity's new chosen line, Azel attempts interference. The implication suggests that forces of corruption actively oppose divine plans for redemption. Every significant step toward restoration meets resistance from the realm of rebellion. The image of the unclean bird carries symbolic significance. Birds represent spirits in many ancient traditions. An unclean bird specifically violates the categories of Levitical law, existing in a state of impurity that separates it from the holy. Azel's manifestation in this form reveals his essential nature. He is the embodiment of everything that stands outside the boundaries of divine order. The repeated attempts to defile the sacrifice mirror Azel's broader function in cosmic history. Just as he taught humanity forbidden knowledge that corrupted their relationship with the divine, here he attempts to corrupt the very ceremony that establishes covenant relationship. His presence threatens to render the sacrifice invalid, to prevent the connection between heaven and earth that Abraham seeks to forge. Abraham's persistence in driving away the bird demonstrates the human capacity for resistance. Unlike the antediluvian humans who accepted the Watcher's teachings, Abraham actively rejects the tempter. He recognizes corruption when he encounters it, and refuses to let it interfere with his mission. This establishes a pattern for future encounters between divine servants and the forces that oppose them. The Apocalypse of Abraham shows Azel at his most active and dangerous. He is no longer bound in a pit, awaiting judgment. Instead, he moves through the world seeking to corrupt and derail divine purposes. This transformation reflects the evolution of thought about evil in the centuries following the composition of the Book of Enoch. The writing also reveals the limits of Azel's power. Despite his cosmic position and his role as Lord of Hell, he cannot overcome a single human who stands firm in devotion to the divine. The angel dismisses him with a command, and he must obey. His authority extends only as far as the divine permits, and no further. This portrayal would influence later traditions profoundly. The image of a spiritual adversary who tempts individuals at crucial moments, who claims authority over the corrupted portions of creation, who rules the realm of punishment, yet remains subordinate to ultimate divine power. These elements come together into the developed concept of a personal devil that emerges in later theology. Satan takes the throne. Azel's legacy in the New Testament. The writings of early followers of Jesus rarely mention fallen angels by name, yet the concepts that developed around Azel and the Watchers permeate their understanding of spiritual conflict. The New Testament presents a cosmic adversary called Satan, the accuser and tempter who leads forces of darkness against the purposes of the divine. This Satan embodies characteristics drawn from multiple sources. He tempts like the serpent in Eden. He accuses, standing before the divine throne to point out human failings. He commands demons and unclean spirits who cause suffering and possess the vulnerable. He rules over a kingdom of darkness that opposes the kingdom of light. In all these roles we glimpse the shadow of Azel. The connection runs deeper than surface similarity. Communities that produced the New Testament writings were steeped in traditions about the fallen Watchers. The Book of Enoch circulated widely. The narrative of angels who descended, corrupted humanity, and faced imprisonment formed part of the shared knowledge that shaped their worldview. Several New Testament passages directly reference this tradition. The letter of Jude quotes the Book of Enoch explicitly, citing the prophecy of coming judgment. Peter's second letter speaks of angels who sinned and were cast into chains of darkness to await judgment. These references demonstrate familiarity with the Watcher's narrative and acceptance of its basic framework. The Gospel accounts present Jesus confronting demons throughout his ministry. These unclean spirits recognize his divine authority and fear his power to cast them into the abyss. The language mirrors the Book of Enoch's description of the fallen angels' terror before divine judgment. The demons know their time is limited, that punishment awaits them at the appointed hour. Satan appears as the primary antagonist in the temptation narrative. After Jesus fasts 40 days in the wilderness, the tempter approaches with offers of power and provision. The wilderness setting connects to the realm where Azel was bound, the desolate places where demons dwell. The nature of the temptation, offering forbidden knowledge of shortcuts and worldly authority, echoes Azel's original sin of teaching corrupting wisdom to humanity. Paul's letters speak of spiritual forces arrayed against believers. Principalities and powers occupy the heavenly places, opposing the divine plan. A god of this world blinds the minds of unbelievers. These cosmic forces require more than human opposition. They represent a spiritual reality that can only be confronted through divine power. The book of Revelation portrays Satan's ultimate fate in imagery that recalls Enochic tradition. The dragon and his angels fight against the heavenly host and lose. He is cast down to earth, then bound for 1,000 years, then released briefly before final judgment casts him into a lake of fire. This progression mirrors the Watcher's journey: rebellion, imprisonment, temporary influence, and ultimate punishment in eternal flames. None of these writings name Azel directly, yet the conceptual DNA proves unmistakable. The New Testament Satan functions as the culmination of ideas about fallen spiritual beings that Azel helped establish. He is the leader of rebellious angels. He corrupts humanity through forbidden knowledge and temptation. He faces certain judgment and eternal punishment. He rules over demons and the realm of the dead. These are Azel's characteristics now concentrated in a single adversary figure. The evolution makes sense within the historical context. As monotheism grew more absolute, the proliferation of named demons and fallen angels became theologically problematic. A single Satan unified the opposition, simplifying the cosmic drama into a clearer conflict between one God and one adversary. Azel's narrative and characteristics merged with other traditions about spiritual evil, producing the comprehensive figure of the devil. This synthesis served practical purposes. Early believers faced persecution and suffering that demanded explanation. Why does evil persist? Why do the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper? The answer lay partly in acknowledging that spiritual forces actively oppose divine purposes. Satan and his angels work to corrupt, accuse, and destroy, yet their power remains limited. Their time is short, and their ultimate defeat is certain. The New Testament also emphasizes human responsibility in ways that the Enoch tradition sometimes obscures. While acknowledging spiritual opposition, these writings insist that humans make real choices. They are not merely passive victims of demonic corruption. They can resist temptation, reject false teaching, and align themselves with divine purposes. The figure of Satan represents real spiritual danger without eliminating human agency. The trajectory from Azazel to Satan reveals how religious ideas develop over centuries. Core concepts persist while adapting to new contexts. The name changes, but the narrative structure remains. Powerful spiritual beings rebel against divine authority, corrupt humanity, face judgment, and await ultimate punishment. This narrative proves remarkably durable across different communities and time periods. By the time the New Testament canon closed, Azazel had effectively disappeared as a named figure in mainstream tradition. Yet his legacy lived on in the developed concept of Satan. Every description of the devil's temptation, every reference to his coming judgment, every portrayal of his corrupting influence, all carry traces of the original narrative about a watcher who taught forbidden knowledge and was bound in the desert to await the end of days. The final judgment. Azazel's ultimate fate in 1 Enoch. The book of Enoch does not end with Azazel's imprisonment in the desert pit. His narrative continues to its ultimate conclusion in the visions of final judgment that close the writing. What was bound will be destroyed. What was hidden in darkness will face consuming fire. Enoch receives these visions during his heavenly journey. Angels guide him through the various levels of reality, showing him the places prepared for both the righteous and the wicked. He sees pleasant meadows where the souls of the faithful await resurrection. He also sees the places of punishment, the valleys of fire where the rebellious angels face their ultimate fate. The writing describes a valley with deep chasms that burn with eternal fire. This place has been prepared specifically for those who corrupted humanity, who led people astray into violence and forbidden practices. The watchers who descended to Mount Hermon will end here, along with their leader. Azazel's crimes receive specific attention. He taught humanity to make weapons of war, enabling violence on a scale previously unknown. He revealed cosmetic arts that led to vanity and sexual corruption. He shared knowledge of signs and celestial movements that should have remained hidden. Each teaching multiplied sin across the earth. The judgment acknowledges these specific transgressions. Unlike the other watchers who lusted after human women and produced the Nephilim giants, Azazel's primary sin was corrupting humanity through forbidden knowledge. Therefore, all the violence and bloodshed that followed stems from his teaching. The writing lays the weight of human wickedness directly at his feet. The punishment fits this comprehensive guilt. Azazel will not simply be destroyed. He will be cast into the eternal fire alongside his fellow rebels. The writing emphasizes the permanence of this fate. There is no escape, no reprieve, no eventual restoration. What fire begins will continue without end. The vision also includes the fate of the Nephilim, the giant offspring of the Watchers. These creatures have already perished in the flood, but their spirits remain active as demons wandering the earth and causing harm. At the final judgment, these evil spirits will also face destruction. The corruption that began with the Watchers' descent will be completely purged from creation. Enoch sees the righteous gathered in contrast to this fate. They receive new bodies and dwell in transformed glory. The earth itself is renewed, becoming a place of perfect peace where violence and corruption no longer exist. This restoration stands as the direct reversal of everything Azazel and the Watchers accomplished through their rebellion. The timing of this judgment matters. It does not occur immediately after the flood. The writing portrays a cosmic timeline where fallen angels remain imprisoned during the age between the first destruction and the final renewal. Azazel lies bound in darkness while human history unfolds above. Only at the end will he face the ultimate punishment. This extended imprisonment serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates divine patience and the complex unfolding of justice. It also explains the continued presence of evil in the world after the flood. While the Watchers themselves are bound, The consequences of their actions ripple through time. The knowledge they shared cannot be unlearned. The violence they introduced continues to plague humanity. The final judgment resolves these lingering effects. When Azazel and his companions burn in eternal fire, the last connection to the original corruption will be severed. The knowledge will lose its corrupting power. The violence will cease. The boundary between heaven and earth, which the watchers violated, will be permanently restored and guarded. The Book of Enoch presents this fate as absolutely certain. The angels who guide Enoch through his visions speak with unwavering confidence about what will occur. They show him the prepared places of punishment before anyone has been cast into them. The future judgment is so assured that it can be discussed as though it has already happened. This certainty serves the writing's larger purpose. The Book of Enoch aims to reassure the faithful that injustice will not stand forever. The wicked prosper now, but their time is limited. Spiritual forces corrupt and destroy, but they face ultimate defeat. Azazel taught weapons and violence, spreading bloodshed across the earth, yet fire awaits him that will consume without mercy. The vision of Azazel's final fate completes his narrative arc. He begins as a powerful spiritual being who descends from heaven. He becomes a teacher of forbidden arts, corrupting humanity and enabling violence. Divine judgment binds him in a desert pit, removing him from direct influence. Finally, at the end of days, he burns in eternal fire, paying the ultimate price for his rebellion and its consequences. This progression from power to imprisonment to destruction establishes a pattern that influences countless later narratives about fallen angels and demons. The arc proves deeply satisfying. Evil may flourish temporarily, may seem to triumph, but ultimate justice prevails. The corrupter becomes the corrupted, consumed by the very forces of destruction he unleashed upon the world. The enduring demon, Azazel's shadow in religion and culture. From a single mention in Leviticus to the complex figure in Enochic tradition, Azazel's journey spans centuries of religious development. His transformation reveals how communities wrestle with questions of evil, corruption, and divine justice. The scapegoat sent into the wilderness becomes the imprisoned watcher, becomes the template for ultimate adversaries. The power of Azazel's narrative lies partly in its ambiguity. The Torah mentions him without explanation, creating space for interpretation. Is he a place, a demon, a concept? This openness allows later traditions to fill the gap with increasingly detailed narratives. The Book of Enoch provides origin and personality. The Apocalypse of Abraham shows him in action. Each edition enriches the figure while maintaining connection to the original. Azazel embodies a specific type of evil, the corruption of knowledge. Unlike figures who simply destroy or oppose, Azazel teaches. He shares secrets that humanity should not possess. The weapons he reveals enable violence. The cosmetics create vanity. The celestial signs offer forbidden insight. His sin lies in transgressing boundaries of knowledge, offering humanity tools and understanding that lead to destruction. This makes him particularly relevant to perennial human concerns. Every generation possesses knowledge that could be used for harm. Every advance in technology or understanding brings potential for corruption alongside benefit. Azazel's narrative warns that some knowledge carries inherent danger, that boundaries exist for good reason, that wisdom requires restraint alongside learning. The geographic location of his punishment reinforces his nature. Bound in the desert wilderness, he inhabits the realm outside cultivation and order. The wilderness represents everything beyond human control, the dangerous places where chaos still holds sway. Sending the scapegoat to Azazel means returning sin to its source, expelling corruption back to the disordered realm where it belongs. Later traditions absorbed Azazel's characteristics into broader figures. Satan inherits his role as tempter and corrupter. Devils and demons take on his quality as a teacher of forbidden arts. The concept of fallen angels who corrupt humanity through superior knowledge becomes foundational to understanding spiritual evil. Yet the original name largely disappears from common usage. This absorption makes sense within monotheistic development. As Judaism, Christianity, and Islam developed more unified concepts of evil, the multiplicity of named demons became problematic. A single adversary simplified the cosmic drama. Yet the narratives that surrounded figures like Azazel proved too compelling to discard. They merged into the characteristics of the devil, preserving their narrative power while adapting to new theological frameworks. Modern readers encounter Azazel primarily through academic study or cultural references. Fantasy literature and occult traditions revive ancient demon names, including Azazel among their hierarchies. These contemporary uses often strip away the complex theological concerns that originally shaped his narrative, reducing him to a generic powerful demon or fallen angel. Yet the core questions his narrative addresses remain urgent. How do we explain the presence of evil in a world created by a good God? Why do humans possess knowledge that enables terrible destruction? What responsibility do we bear for the misuse of what we know? Where does corruption originate, and how can it be cleansed? These concerns motivated the ancient writers who developed Azazel's narrative, and they continue to trouble thoughtful people today. The scapegoat ritual that introduced Azazel addresses a fundamental human need, the removal of guilt and corruption. Communities require mechanisms for dealing with accumulated sin. The goat bearing the people's transgressions into the wilderness provides vivid imagery for this necessary cleansing. That the goat goes specifically to Azazel adds depth. Sin returns to its ultimate source, the one who first taught humanity to transgress. The Day of Atonement ceremony remains central to Jewish practice, though modern interpretation focuses more on repentance and divine forgiveness than on the scapegoat's destination. Yet the ritual's structure preserves the ancient understanding. Some sins require more than forgiveness. They need removal, expulsion, return to the chaos from which they emerged. Christian tradition adapted this imagery in powerful ways. The idea of a perfect sacrifice bearing away sin informs core theological concepts. Yet where the Levitical goat went to Azazel in the wilderness, Christian understanding sees the sacrifice as complete in itself, needing no demon to receive what is expelled. The later tradition maintains the function while eliminating Azazel from the process. The scholarly recovery of writings like the Book of Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls brought Azazel back into view for modern audiences. These discoveries revealed the rich traditions of Second Temple Judaism that shaped early Christian thinking. They showed how communities developed complex angelologies and demonologies, creating detailed narratives to explain spiritual realities. These writings also reveal religious creativity in action. Ancient writers took sparse biblical references and constructed elaborate narratives. They wove together different traditions, adding details and connections that made sense within their worldview. The result was a living tradition that adapted to new questions while maintaining continuity with the past. Azazel stands as a prime example of this process. From enigmatic mention to developed character to absorbed legacy, his narrative traces the evolution of religious ideas across centuries. He demonstrates how communities remember, adapt, and transform their traditions to address enduring questions about evil, corruption, divine justice, and ultimate restoration. The fallen watcher imprisoned in the desert awaits his final fate in fire, yet his shadow extends across religious history, shaping how countless people understand the forces that corrupt and the judgment that awaits them. In this way, Azazel achieves a kind of immortality, not the divine eternity he perhaps sought in rebellion, but the enduring presence of a powerful narrative that continues to illuminate the darkness humans face.